The engine coughed once, a low, guttural bark that shuddered through every bolt and every weld of the cramped steel hull. And then it caught, and the smell hit them all at once. Petroleum and iron filings and the particular sour cold of a January morning in Prussia. A cold so deep it felt like the earth itself had decided to stop pretending it cared whether you survived. Inside the fighting compartment, barely large enough to hold 4 men without someone's elbow finding someone else's ribs, the crew of the Jagdpanzer 38 did what they always did before a mission. They breathed slow and said very little. There was not much to say. The ground shook. Not from artillery. Not yet, though artillery would come soon enough. It shook from mass, from the distant rhythmic percussion of hundreds of armored tracks grinding eastward, through frozen mud, through frozen fields, through villages that had been burning for 3 days and would burn for 3 more. The Soviets were not advancing. They were arriving. There is a difference. An advance implies friction, resistance, the possibility of delay. What the Red Army was doing in January of 1945 across the breadth of East Prussia was something closer to a tide. It did not ask permission. It did not slow for obstacles. It simply came and came and came. And the men in the little steel box dug into the shadow of a ruined farmhouse knew, each of them, exactly what it meant to be standing in its path. Lieutenant Hans Joachim Gebhardt pressed his eye against the rubber housing of the SFLZF-1A, the periscopic gun sight that was for him the closest thing to a window in this world of cold metal. And he looked at the road. He had been looking at that road for 2 hours. He had memorized it. He knew where the frozen ruts were deepest, where the surface was hard enough to carry weight at speed, and where it would swallow a track like wet concrete. He knew the exact angle at which the morning light would catch. The side armor of a JS-2 as it crested the low ridge, 600 meters to the northeast, the one with the 3 dead birch trees standing against the sky like white ribs. He had done all the mathematics in his head the night before, lying in his bedroll in the barn that still smelled of cows and warm hay, working through angles and distances with the same calm focus another man might use to solve an accounting problem. The difference was that his accounting problem, if he got it wrong, would end with 4 men burning inside 2 tons of German steel. He did not intend to get it wrong. What happened in the next several hours in that forgotten corner of a collapsing empire would be one of the most technically precise and psychologically extraordinary feats of armored combat in the entire history of the Second World War. A story that never quite made it into the history books, absorbed into the immense, indifferent noise of a war that was killing people faster than anyone could record their names. But it happened, and it deserves to be told the way it actually was. From the inside, from the cold, from the smell of gun oil and fear and the particular silence that falls over a crew in the seconds before the first round is chambered. The Jagdpanzer 38, known by its crews, its enemies, and eventually history by the nickname Hetzer, a word that translates roughly as agitator or baiter, a word that implies something small and sharp that gets under the skin of something larger, was not supposed to be a serious weapon. That is worth saying plainly, because the story of the Hetzer is, in a very real sense, the story of necessity, being the mother not just of invention, but of unexpected brilliance. By 1944, Germany was running out of everything: steel, fuel, factory floor space, time, and the industrial capacity to build the kind of heavy, sophisticated, armored vehicles that had once made the Wehrmacht the most feared ground force in the world. The Tiger was magnificent, yes, but a Tiger required an extraordinary investment of resources for every single unit produced. The Panther was fast and deadly, but complex and prone to mechanical misery. The Wehrmacht needed something simpler, cheaper, and above all faster to manufacture in the massive quantities that a two-front war was consuming at a rate that made the accountants at the Armaments Ministry wake up at night in cold sweats. The solution they arrived at was almost embarrassingly logical. Take an existing chassis that was already in production, one that the factories already knew how to build without extensive retraining, and put a good gun on it. The chassis in question was the Panzer 38T, a pre-war Czech design that had been in German service since the conquest of Czechoslovakia in 1939. By 1944, the original tank design was hopelessly obsolete as a fighting vehicle. Its armor was too thin, its gun too light, and it would have lasted approximately as long as a paper bag in rain against a T-34. But the chassis itself was sound, low, reliable, mechanically straightforward, and easily manufactured by the Czechoslovak factories at BMM in Prague that were already running full shifts under German occupation. Strip the turret off. Lower the hull profile. Install a proper gun behind an angled superstructure. That was, in essence, the entire design brief. What emerged was something that surprised almost everyone, including the engineers who built it. The Hetzer was small, genuinely, almost aggressively small, with a height of just 2 meters and 17 centimeters, which made it shorter than many of the men who would eventually crew it when standing at full stretch. Its length was just under 4.5 meters. It weighed 15.5 tons, which sounds significant until you compare it to the 27 tons of a Panzer IV, let alone the 45 tons of a Panther. A fuel truck could carry enough fuel to fill 3 Hetzers. The armor, though not exceptional in absolute numbers, was arranged with geometric intelligence. The front glacis plate was 60 millimeters thick, which would have been modest for 1944 if it had been hung vertically, but it was not hung vertically. It was angled at 60 degrees from the vertical, an inclination so steep that the effective thickness against a perpendicular shot was nearly doubled through the simple physics of oblique impact, a property that forced any incoming round to travel through a much longer path of steel or to deflect entirely. A Soviet 76 millimeter round, which was perfectly capable of blowing through 60 millimeters of flat plate at close range, would shatter or ricochet off that same plate when it arrived at 60 degrees. This was not an accident of design. It was the entire point. The gun was the 7.5 centimeter PaK 39L/48. A weapon that had already proven its worth in the PZKPFW-4 and that, at combat ranges below 1,000 meters, could defeat the frontal armor of virtually every Soviet tank then in service, with the exception of the JS-2 at close range. The JS-2, the JS-2 Stalin heavy tank, was a different matter, a 68-ton monster with a 122 millimeter gun that fired a shell so large it had to be loaded in 2 separate pieces, a weapon so powerful that its blast could strip the turret off a Tiger at 500 meters. Against the JS-2, the Hetzer's gun needed ideal conditions, a flank shot, or a shot against the lower hull, or a hit at very close range against the front plate at just the right angle. Frontal encounters between a Hetzer and a JS-2 at medium range were, on paper, one-sided affairs. The JS-2 would win. The Hetzer's crew knew this. They planned around it. The entire tactical philosophy of the Jagdpanzer 38 was built on the premise that you did not fight the enemy on his terms. You fought him on yours, which meant you chose the ground. You chose the moment, and you made certain that by the time the enemy realized you existed, it was already too late for him to do anything about it. There was a complication, however. One of those engineering compromises that haunts a vehicle for its entire operational life, that becomes so fundamental to the experience of operating it that crews eventually stop thinking of it as a limitation and start thinking of it as simply the nature of the beast. The POC 39 was mounted off-center, displaced to the right of the vehicle's longitudinal axis, which gave the gun an asymmetric traverse arc that was, to put it gently, extremely limited. The weapon could swing 11 degrees to the left of center and 5 degrees to the right. That was it. 16 degrees of total horizontal coverage. By comparison, a tank with a rotating turret could engage targets across a full 360 degrees simply by spinning. The Hetzer's crew could not spin. To bring the gun to bear on a target outside those 16 degrees, the driver had to physically slew the entire vehicle on its tracks, a maneuver that required coordination between the commander and the driver, that took precious seconds, that required the driver to feel through his controls exactly how many centimeters of vehicle movement corresponded to how many degrees of gun traverse, and that generated noise and track marks and dust and all the other evidence that announced to any attentive observer, there is something here. In the wrong hands, this limitation made the Hetzer a liability. In the right hands, it made it a discipline, a forcing function that demanded precision positioning before the engagement began, not during it, because during it there was no time. You had to be already pointing at the thing you were going to shoot before you knew you were going to shoot it. Gebhardt had been in the right hands for 2 years. He did not think of the traverse limit as a problem. He thought of it as part of the calculation. He had come to the Hetzer the way most German tank commanders came to any vehicle, through a succession of losses, reassignments, and the constant slow attrition that was gradually hollowing out the Wehrmacht from within. He had started the war in a Panzer III, had survived France, had survived the first winter in Russia by a margin he still did not entirely understand, and had eventually arrived at the Kachiakari units, the tank destroyers, through a combination of official reassignment and the kind of informal recommendation that happened when someone noticed you were still alive when your peers were not. The Hetzer had arrived in his unit in the middle of 1944, and his first reaction, the reaction that most men had, was amusement followed by unease. It was so small. Standing next to a JS-2 or even a T-34, it looked like a toy. But he had driven it and loaded it and fired it and watched what the gun did to targets at 300 meters, and the unease had faded. What replaced it was something closer to respect. This was not a tank in any conventional sense. It was a trap with an engine. You did not take it into open country and brawl with the enemy, because it would lose that fight every time. You took it into the broken ground, the ravines and ruins, the copses of dead trees and the shadows of collapsed buildings, and you made yourself invisible. And you waited, and when the time came, you performed a single act of precise, lethal geometry. Then, ideally, you moved before anyone had time to calculate where the shot had come from. He had spent the last 18 months doing exactly that, across the vast, terrible landscape of the Eastern Front, and he had arrived January 1945 alive and with a refined, almost serene understanding of what his machine could do. He knew the exact noise the Praga AC-2 engine made when it was running too cold and likely to stall. He knew the smell of the hydraulic fluid when the traversing mechanism was starting to bind in freezing temperatures, and he knew how to work the controls in a way that kept it moving even when the seals wanted to contract and jam. He knew that the gun mantlet, that rounded steel protrusion around the barrel, created a slight shot trap, a geometric oddity where certain incoming rounds could be deflected downward through the front deck rather than away from the vehicle. And he knew where not to position himself relative to likely enemy firing positions to minimize that risk. He knew how many degrees of side slope he could tolerate before the vehicle's low center of gravity became a liability rather than an asset. He knew all of this not because he had read it in a manual, though the manuals existed, but because the vehicle had taught him over thousands of kilometers of combat driving, and he had been a willing student. The winter of 1944 into 1945 had been the worst, not the coldest. There had been worse cold in 1941 and 1942, but the worst in terms of what was being asked of the men who were still fighting. The Vistula-Oder offensive, which the Soviets had launched in January, with a force of over 2 million men, 11,000 tanks, and an artillery density that created a continuous roar audible 100 kilometers away, was not a military operation in any sense that Gebhardt had been trained to think about. It was an erasure. Cities that had stood for centuries were being ground to powder. Roads that had carried German supply columns for years were now carrying Soviet supply columns going in the opposite direction. The maps in Gebhardt's command post were almost useless, not because they were inaccurate, but because the ground they described was changing faster than any map could record, because what had been a German-held town on Tuesday was a rubble field contested by both sides on Wednesday and a Soviet rear area on Thursday. In this environment, the normal concepts of front lines and defensive positions had dissolved into something more like a mobile, three-dimensional chaos in which individual crews and small units were making life and death decisions without reference to any higher command, because higher command was either gone, out of radio contact, or issuing orders that bore no relationship to any reality that anyone on the ground could recognize. Gebhardt's unit, Heeres Panzerjägerabteilung 741, had been badly mauled in the weeks leading up to the engagement. Of the Hetzers that had started the campaign, fewer than half were still running, and of those, several had mechanical problems, serious enough that they were being held back for cannibalization, stripped for parts to keep the others alive. The maintenance crews worked without sleep in temperatures that froze lubricants and turned metal tools into conductors for cold, so intense it felt like a burn. A man could not hold bare metal in those temperatures without gloves, and the work that needed doing inside an engine compartment required bare hands. The mechanics had developed a rhythm of work, stop, warm, that extended every job to 3 times its normal duration and left everyone perpetually behind schedule, which in a combat environment did not mean inconvenience. It meant death if the vehicle that should have been ready was not ready when the column of Soviet tanks came around the corner. Gebhardt had one advantage that the desperate situation of the Wehrmacht in January 1945 could not entirely negate. He was very good at his job, and his crew knew it, and knowing it meant they trusted him. And trust in a 4-man fighting vehicle with 16 degrees of gun traverse is not a luxury. It is the mechanism by which the vehicle functions. The loader, an 18-year-old from Silesia, named Werner, who had been with Gebhardt for 8 months and who had developed the ability to ram around into the breech of the Pak-39 in less than 4 seconds, even with hands so cold he could barely feel them, trusted the commander's judgment about when to fire and when to wait. The driver, a 22-year-old named Erich, with an almost supernatural sensitivity to the vehicle's behavior through his controls, he could tell when a cog in the final drive was beginning to wear, weeks before it failed, purely by the feel of it through the floor pedals, trusted that Gebhardt's positioning decisions would give him the best possible firing geometry before the shooting started. The gunner, Feldwebel Kurt, who had been with armored units since 1940 and who had opinions about tanks the way other men had opinions about music, trusted that when Gebhardt identified a target and gave a range, the range was right. Because in 8 months of combat, Gebhardt had never been more than 20 meters off a range estimate, and 20 meters at 300 meters distance was well within the kill zone of the Pak-39. This was the crew that settled into position in the ruins of the Braun farmstead in the pre-dawn darkness of a morning in mid-January. The farmstead had been abandoned for at least a week. Gebhardt could tell from the state of the snow inside the roofless barn, from the frozen food on the kitchen table, from the family photographs still hanging crooked on the wall of the main house, their faces staring out with the fixed, uncomprehending expressions of people who had believed until almost the last moment that they were safe. The Hetzer had been driven into the barn from the rear, using a route that avoided the open ground to the north, and that had been scouted on foot the previous evening by Gebhardt himself, walking alone in the dark with a compass and a map and the particular intense alertness of a man who knows that any footprint in the wrong place is information given to the enemy for free. The barn's north wall had partially collapsed, creating a natural embrasure, a gap in the masonry, framed by frozen timber beams that pointed almost exactly in the direction Gebhardt wanted to point his gun. The fallen roof beams created a profile so irregular that from outside, and especially from the northeast where the road ran, the superstructure of the Hetzer was visually indistinguishable from debris. He had spent the first hour adjusting. The Hetzer was already positioned to present its front glasses toward the most likely axis of enemy advance, but there was a difference of roughly 4 degrees between the bearing of the embrasure and the optimal firing line to the crest of the ridge where the road crested before descending toward the village. 4 degrees. For another vehicle, anything with a rotating turret, this was not a problem. For the Hetzer, with 11 degrees of left traverse, 4 degrees was entirely manageable, but only if the vehicle was positioned with that 4 degrees already within the traverse arc, not eating into it. Gebhardt worked Eric through a series of tiny adjustments, each one just a few centimeters of track movement, communicating through the intercom in short, flat phrases while watching through the gun sight as the crosshairs swung slowly across the skyline until they rested exactly where he wanted them. The engine idled at minimum revolutions, just enough to maintain the hydraulic pressure the traversing mechanism needed, the exhaust muffled by the snow that had drifted against the back wall of the barn. By the time the sky began to lighten, not bright, never truly bright in a Prussian January, but less black than it had been, everything was ready. The gun was loaded. The range was set. The crew was still. The machine was cold and patient and ready, like a coiled spring waiting in the dark. The sounds began before the shapes appeared. This was typical. Armor makes a noise unlike anything else in the acoustic landscape of war. A low, grinding, rhythmic percussion that comes through the ground before it comes through the air, a sound that crew members in armored vehicles experienced as a vibration felt through the floor and the seat and the backs of the legs before the ears registered it consciously. Gebhardt felt it first in his boot soles. Then he heard it. The distant churning grind of tracks on frozen ground, multiplied into a continuous bass note by the sheer number of vehicles producing it. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He pressed his eye tighter against the gun sight and waited for the first shape to appear on the ridge. The JS-2 came over the crest at approximately 600 meters, moving at moderate speed on the road, its distinctive high turret and long gun barrel silhouetted against the pale sky for just a moment before it descended toward the village, then another, then 2 more in close succession, then a gap of 30 seconds, then 3 more. Gebhardt counted them and registered their spacing and made a calculation that had nothing to do with mathematics in any formal sense, but everything to do with the accumulated, embodied knowledge of a man who had spent 2 years studying the behavior of armored columns in exactly these conditions. They were moving with confidence. They were not expecting trouble. The column spacing was tight. Vehicles closer together than standard doctrine recommended for an advance into uncertain territory, which meant either that the column commander was experienced and confident enough to accept the risk of a bunching attack, or that he had intelligence suggesting the road was clear, or the most useful possibility, that he was simply behind schedule and pushing hard to make up time. Tight column spacing had one implication that mattered enormously to Gebhardt. If the lead vehicle stopped suddenly, the ones behind it would be forced to stop or maneuver, and in the time it took to sort out that chaos, a crew with a preloaded gun and a known firing solution could do extraordinary damage. He let them come. This was the discipline. The single hardest thing about ambush warfare, harder than the physical demands of cold and confinement and fatigue, which were severe enough. The hardest thing was waiting past the point where every instinct and every surge of adrenaline was screaming at you to act, because the instinct was working on civilian timescales, and the reality of the situation demanded something slower and more precise. He wanted the lead tank at 300 meters. At 300 meters, the Pak-39's kinetic energy penetrator would arrive before the sound of the shot, and the angle of impact against the JS-2's side armor, the kill zone, not the frontal plate that even the largest German gun struggled with, would be close to ideal. He had measured the distance to 3 reference points the night before: a fence post, a particular tree, a section of stone wall. The lead tank passed the fence post, and he felt Kurt settle into the gunner's seat with a tiny but distinct movement, and he said quietly into the intercom, "Wait." And Kurt waited. The lead tank passed the tree. Werner's breathing was audible in the intercom circuit, regular, deliberate, a young man managing his body the way Gebhardt had taught him. "Wait." The lead tank reached the stone wall, and Gebhardt said, "Fire." The Pa-39 fired, and the sound was enormous in the confined space of the barn, a crack and boom that arrived as a single physical event, like being punched in the chest by something you could not see, followed immediately by the rush of propellant gas, the clatter of the spent case ejecting, the ringing in ears that was already becoming familiar enough to be simply background. Gebhardt watched through the gun sight. The round, Panzergranate 39 armor-piercing capped shell traveling at 790 meters per second covered the 300 meters between the gun muzzle and the side of the lead JS-2 in just over a third of a second. In that fraction of a second, the column continued to move. Gebhardt continued to breathe, and the world continued to exist in its normal, unremarkable state. And then the round struck. It went through the side armor of the JS-2. The side was significantly thinner than the frontal plate, 90 millimeters nominally, but at this angle, effectively less, and entered the fighting compartment where it did what kinetic energy penetrators do inside a closed metal box filled with ammunition and fuel. It converted itself and everything around it into fire. The JS-2 stopped. Not the gradual slowing of a vehicle that has been hit in a non-critical component, but the immediate, absolute cessation of a vehicle that has ceased to function at the most fundamental level. Its tracks stopped. Its engine stopped. For 2 seconds, it sat there intact, and then the fire reached the ammunition, and it did not stop. It came apart, the turret lifting momentarily before falling back at an angle, and the hull began to burn with a black, thick smoke that rose straight up in the cold, still air. The column bunched, exactly as he had expected. The second tank attempted to break and swing wide of the burning wreck, and in doing so, it presented its flank to the embrasure, and Gebhardt said, "Loaded?" Werner, who had been reloading from the moment the first round left the barrel, said, "Loaded." And Gebhardt said, "Fire." Kurt fired. The second JS-2 took the hit in the lower hull where the armor transitioned from the side glacis to the belly plate, not the shot Gebhardt had wanted, which was a direct penetration. But the ricochet geometry worked in his favor, and the round punched through on the deflection, entering the engine compartment. The second tank did not explode. It began to burn slowly, a long tongue of flame from the engine deck, and the hatches opened and the crew attempted to evacuate, and the infantry that should have been protecting the column and watching the flanks was not watching this particular flank, because the column had been moving with the confidence of an army that believed itself to be through the contested zone. This confidence, which had probably been earned by 2 weeks of rapid advance and minimal resistance, was the most important single factor in what happened next. The third tank had stopped behind the second, and its commander, responding to the contact drill he had presumably been trained to execute, was attempting to determine the direction of fire. The smoke from the first 2 burning tanks was drifting southwest, which meant the wind was from the northeast, which meant the propellant smoke from the Hetzer's gun was also drifting southwest, away from the barn, which was in the northwest quadrant relative to the road. But smoke from an 88mm gun firing in an enclosed space does not drift neatly in the direction of the wind. It blooms first in all directions before the wind takes it, and Gebhardt knew this, and after the second shot he told Eric to begin the traverse. Not a full repositioning, just a few degrees. Left, using the available traverse arc to shift the gun toward the third tank, which was now stationary and thus a different kind of target than a moving one. A moving target requires a lead calculation. A stationary target is simply a geometry problem, and geometry problems have exact answers. The third shot hit the third JS-2 in the turret ring, the junction between the turret and the hull, which on the JS-2 was a point of relative weakness, and the turret jammed in place, traversed to the wrong angle, pointing its enormous gun at nothing useful, while the Hetzer was to the north. The third tank was not destroyed, but it was mission killed. A vehicle whose gun cannot traverse is, in a close engagement against a mobile enemy, effectively out of the fight. Gebhardt registered this and moved on. 3 tanks, 3 shots, perhaps 90 seconds since the first round was fired. Werner was already loading the 4th round, his movements automatic and utterly without wasted motion. Oh, young man who had become, through sheer repetition and necessity, one of the fastest loaders in the battalion. What happened over the next 4 hours, and it was hours, not the apocalyptic minutes that the summary might suggest, was a demonstration of something more profound than marksmanship, or crew coordination, or even tactical intelligence, though it required all of those things. It was a demonstration of the total integration of man and machine that is, in the end, the fundamental subject of this story. Gebhardt did not have a vehicle. He had a partner, a limited, cramped, mechanically idiosyncratic, and in some ways dangerously under-equipped partner, but a partner nonetheless, one whose limitations he had made his own, and whose capabilities he had extended through intimate knowledge into something that exceeded what the design specifications alone could have predicted. The Hetzer was not supposed to kill 12 JS-2s. That was not a scenario that existed in the training manual. But the training manuals had been written by people who knew the vehicle's specifications, not by people who knew the vehicle. The Soviet response was predictable, and from Gebhardt's perspective, something he had anticipated and planned around. When a column takes fire from an ambush, the correct response is immediate and violent. Maximum firepower directed at the likely ambush position, combined with a flanking movement by whatever elements are not directly engaged. The problem the Soviet column commander faced was that he did not have a precise ambush position. He had a direction, roughly northwest, and he had the burning evidence of 3 tanks, but the 4th, 5th, and 6th tanks that began engaging the area to the northwest were engaging an area, not a point. They were laying rounds into a 300 meters stretch of ground that included the farmstead, a stand of trees, a low earthen wall, and 200 meters of open field. The Hetzer was in the farmstead, yes, but the farmstead was now producing enough smoke from its burning outbuildings, secondary fires ignited by the muzzle blast, and the general chaos of the opening engagement, that the specific source of the anti-tank fire was genuinely unclear. This was not luck. Gebhardt had chosen the position partly for this reason. The barn's location relative to the other structures meant that incoming rounds that missed the Hetzer would strike masonry and timber rather than open ground, generating secondary debris and smoke that complicated the enemy's spotting problem. He had looked at this ground the night before in the dark and had understood its geometry, and now the geometry was working for him. The Soviet tanks could not sit still and engage indefinitely. There was a column behind them, and behind that column were probably others, and the road needed to be clear, and 3 burning wrecks were making it very much not clear. The 4th tank in the original column attempted to drive around the burning vehicles to the east, and in doing so entered a stretch of road that was visible from the embrasure at a range of approximately 400 meters, and Gebhardt shot it in the forward track run. Not a kill shot, but a mobility kill, the tank dropping to its left as the track failed, and the drive wheel began to spin freely, the vehicle slewing sideways and blocking the road again. The 5th tank, attempting to follow through on the east side, found its path blocked by the immobilized 4th. The 6th tank, the last in the original formation, reversed hard. Gebhardt could see its track plumes as it backed away from the ambush kill zone, and he let it go. A retreating tank is a problem for someone else, and chasing it would require repositioning in a way that might expose the Hetzer to the guns of the tanks that were now engaging the area to the northwest. The engagement went on. Soviet infantry, dismounted from the trucks in the rear of the column, attempted twice to approach the farmstead on foot, working through the snow-covered fields to the south and east. The first attempt was broken up by the MG-34 mounted coaxially on the Hetzer's superstructure, the machine guns high-pitched, tearing burp of fire crossing the open ground at angles that the infantry had not anticipated because they had not known exactly where the vehicle was until it fired. The second infantry attempt came closer, to within perhaps 80 meters of the barn's south wall, before a combination of the defensive fire and the simple difficulty of crossing open ground against a dug-in position forced them back. Gebhardt was aware throughout that he was expending machine gun ammunition at a rate he could not sustain indefinitely, and that the POC 39 rounds in the vehicle's ammunition stowage were a finite resource that every shot reduced, and that at some point the calculus would shift from sustainable to desperate. The geometry of the engagement was also shifting. The Soviet column had stopped, which meant it had time to think, and thinking produced one inevitable conclusion. The best way to deal with a vehicle in a built position was to come around behind it. The flanking attempt came from the west, where a shallow depression in the ground provided cover for 2 T-34/85s, a different vehicle from the JS-2s in the main column, faster and with less armor, but with a gun perfectly capable of killing a Hetzer at short range that had apparently detoured off the main road to find a route around the blocked column. Gebhardt heard them before he saw them. The different engine note of the T-34's V2 diesel, a distinctive, slightly higher frequency compared to the JS-2's diesel coming from his left and rear. This was the moment where the Hetzer's limitations, its 16 degrees of traverse, its inability to turn its gun without turning its hull, threatened to become fatal, because the approaching tanks were behind the traverse arc and in a direction where repositioning would require reversing out of the barn and re-entering at a different angle, a maneuver that would take minutes he did not have. He made a different decision. He told Eric to pivot the entire vehicle on its left track, not reversing but rotating in place, a maneuver that was physically possible, but that generated immediate risk. Swinging the vehicle meant swinging the front glacis away from the northeast, where Soviet infantry and at least 2 intact JS-2s were still present and looking for a target. He was buying protection in one direction by temporarily surrendering it in another, a gamble whose terms were clear enough and whose alternative was worse. The pivot took 11 seconds. Gebhardt counted them. 11 seconds with the Hetzer's rear and side exposed to the northeast, 11 seconds in which a gunner in one of the surviving JS-2s might acquire the target, solve the geometry, and fire. The Soviet gunner either did not see it, or did not have a clear shot through the smoke, or saw it, and hesitated for reasons that Gebhardt would never know. The pivot completed. The gun swung left as far as the traverse allowed, and through the gun sight, Gebhardt acquired the nearer of the 2 T-34/85s at approximately 180 meters, a range at which the PaK-39's penetrator would go through the T-34's frontal armor as though it were furniture. He said, "Fire." Kurt fired. The T-34 died immediately, a single-shot kill that hit the driver's plate and turned the forward hull into a closed chamber for a rapidly expanding fireball. The second T-34, finding itself suddenly alone and close to something that had just killed its companion in one shot from a position it had not seen coming, reversed into the depression and did not come back out. The engagement continued in declining intensity through the late morning. Soviet fire on the farmstead became sporadic, probing rather than purposeful, as though the column was waiting for something, perhaps additional forces, perhaps artillery, perhaps simply for the situation to clarify itself. Gebhardt had been in this situation before, and he knew what it meant. He had perhaps 30 to 40 minutes before the weight of available Soviet firepower made his position untenable. This was not a moment for sentiment. He began to plan his withdrawal while the gun was still firing, working through the route back to the east that he had scouted the night before, calculating how long the engine would take to warm from its present idle state to the operating temperature needed for a cross-country movement in these conditions, confirming with Eric that the track tension was still correct after the hours of stationary operation in the cold. The final count, by the time Gebhardt gave the order to withdraw and Eric began backing the Hetzer out of the barn under covering fire from the MG-34, was 12 armored vehicles confirmed, destroyed or mission killed, 7 JS-2s and 5 T-34s, with the western road through that sector blocked by burning wrecks for the better part of 12 hours, long enough to require the Soviet column to divert through routes that added 3 hours to their advanced timeline. The Hetzer came out of the engagement with 2 minor penetrations from close-range tank gun fragments, a damaged track link that required field replacement, and 4 men who were alive. In the entire history of armored warfare, It would be difficult to find a better example of what the combination of tactical intelligence, mechanical intimacy, and sheer cold nerve could accomplish with a vehicle that most people at headquarters had written off as a compromise of necessity rather than a weapon of choice. The retreat from East Prussia that followed was not the story of a triumphant unit building on success. It was the story of an army in the final stages of dissolution, moving west under pressure that grew heavier with every day, losing vehicles not to enemy fire, but to mechanical failure and fuel shortages, and the simple exhaustion of men who had been fighting continuously for 4 years and who could see clearly enough that it was ending. Gebhardt's unit fought several more engagements over the following weeks, each one conducted with the same fundamental discipline, the prepared position, the careful geometry, the exploitation of the Hetzer's invisibility at the expense of its mobility. But the outcomes were diminishing returns, not because the crew was less skilled, but because the strategic situation had passed beyond the point where tactical excellence could alter its trajectory. You could stop a column for 12 hours. You could not stop an army of 2 million. The Hetzer itself, Gebhardt's specific vehicle, the machine that had crouched in the shadows of the Braun farmstead and conducted its quiet, deadly arithmetic against the steel giants of the Red Army, did not survive the war intact. Most vehicles did not. The combination of combat damage, mechanical wear, fuel deprivation, and the ordered destruction of equipment that could not be moved or repaired meant that by the spring of 1945, the vast majority of German armored vehicles were wrecks, abandoned in fields and roadsides across 1,000 kilometers of Central Europe. Some were blown up by their own crews. Some were captured and taken back for Soviet analysis. Some simply stopped running and were left where they stopped. And the grass grew up around them, and the rust took them, and the earth eventually reclaimed them. Blocco sette, eredita, e valore storico. What survived was the design. The Hetzer, despite, or perhaps because of, its origins as a compromise solution to a resource crisis, turned out to be one of the better conceived tank destroyers of the Second World War. A conclusion that required no special advocacy because the evidence was provided by history's most pragmatic judges, the armies that came after. Czechoslovakia, restored to independence after 1945, continued manufacturing the Jagdpanzer 38 in its factories under a new designation, the STVZ-38, for years after the German defeat. Switzerland, a country with no ideological investment in German military achievements, but a considerable practical interest in effective armored vehicles that could defend mountainous terrain, where mobility and concealment mattered more than brute force, acquired a substantial fleet of Hetzers and kept them in service into the 1970s. These were not countries that had any particular reason to speak well of German wartime engineering. They were simply countries that looked at the vehicle and recognized that someone, working under desperate constraints with inadequate resources, had solved several important problems correctly. The tactical legacy is harder to quantify, but in some ways more significant. The Hetzer proved something that tank doctrine in 1944 was still in the process of learning, that size and stealth and positional intelligence could, in the right circumstances, substitute for the raw armor and firepower that were becoming the standard metrics of armored vehicle evaluation. The JS-2 was, by almost every conventional measure, a vastly superior vehicle. More firepower, more armor, more range, more presence on the battlefield. What it could not do was disappear. What it could not do was choose its ground. What it could not do was transform a built position into a fortress through the intimate knowledge of a crew that had learned over months of combat to think of their vehicle not as a tool they operated, but as an extension of their own bodies, an organism of steel and fire that breathed through a diesel engine and saw through an optical gun sight and moved through the collaborative intelligence of 4 men who had arrived through the grinding process of war at something approaching perfect trust. There is a question worth sitting with, one that goes beyond the tactical calculus and the armor penetration tables and the column of killed vehicles that stands at the end of the ledger. We ask it not to arrive at a comfortable answer, but because it is the only question that really matters when we look at stories like this one. What do we do with the knowledge that human excellence, genuine, extraordinary, even beautiful excellence, can exist in service of an institution that was conducting genocide, an institution built on the premise that some human beings were less valuable than others and could be disposed of accordingly? Gebhardt and his crew were not, as far as the available historical record suggests, war criminals. They were soldiers conducting what they understood to be a legitimate, defensive engagement against an advancing enemy. But they were soldiers of the Third Reich, and the resources that maintained their vehicle and fed their crew and manufactured their ammunition were produced by a system that was simultaneously operating death camps at industrial scale. The craftsmanship and the horror are not separable. They occurred in the same time, in the same place, using the same infrastructure. This is not an argument against remembering Gebhardt's achievement. Memory is not endorsement. What happened in that farmstead in January 1945 was real, and it was remarkable, and it deserves to be understood precisely because it forces us to hold complexity without flinching, to recognize that military excellence and moral catastrophe can coexist in the same army, sometimes in the same individual. The more important question, perhaps, is what we choose to do with the capabilities that stories like this reveal, the extraordinary things that human beings can accomplish when they are given hard constraints, intimate technical knowledge, and a reason to persist. Those capabilities belong to the human species, not to any particular flag or ideology, and they are available to any society that chooses to cultivate them in any cause. The Hetzer, the concept, the approach, the fundamental insight that smallness and intelligence could survive against bigness and power, lives on in the doctrine of every modern anti-tank unit that chooses concealment over armor. It lives on in the design philosophy of every light-armored vehicle that uses terrain as its primary protection. It lives on in every engagement where a smaller, smarter force has found a way to defeat a larger, slower one by choosing the ground and the moment rather than accepting the terms the larger force would prefer. The vehicle that Gebhardt described as an extension of his body has been dissolved back into the earth, but the lesson it taught about the relationship between man and machine, the lesson that the sum of that relationship, when it achieves its full expression, is something greater than either component alone. That lesson persists. The next time you find yourself in a situation where the numbers are against you, where the weight of what you are facing seems disproportionate to the resources you have available, think about a cold morning in East Prussia. Think about a crew of 4 in a box of steel barely taller than a man, with 16 degrees of gun traverse and 12 Soviet tanks in front of them, and no good options. And then think about how they looked at those constraints and found within them the exact shape of a solution. Think about what it means to know your tools so well that their limitations become part of your strengths. Think about what trust among people who are depending on each other for their lives actually looks like, when it is real rather than theoretical. Think about patience, the specific disciplined patience of the ambush, the willingness to wait past the point of discomfort until the geometry is exactly right, and ask yourself, what could you accomplish if you were willing to be that patient, that disciplined, that intimate with the tools and the ground and the moment? If this story reached you, if the cold of that Prussian morning found its way through the screen and you felt, even briefly, the weight of that gun sight against your eye and the vibration of the engine through your boots, consider sharing it. Because history has a way of burying the stories that do not fit easily into its master narratives, and buried stories can tell us nothing. The Hetzer and the men who crewed it deserve to be more than a footnote. Drop a comment below about which part of this story struck you hardest, or which crew member's experience you found yourself identifying with. Those responses matter more than you might think. They help shape which stories get told next. The archives are full of forgotten names and rusting steel. Help decide which ones come back into the light.